Hello and welcome. I'm so excited to be coming to you in the very first month of the year 2025. Welcome to the new year. And I'm also excited because we're going to be talking about courageous leadership today. And for those of you that have followed this series so far, it's something that I only introduced last year and I've been testing things out. But the idea is that courageous leadership is about having a monthly conversation with a guest or a panel of guests where we dive into thought provoking topics, sharing our diverse perspectives from different industry experts and specialists. And the whole idea and the mission is to inspire a lot of people who struggle maybe with leadership and difficult conversations or difficult areas of leadership. We want to address those things. We want to help people to find the courage to speak up, drive change, and contribute meaningfully to the world. I always say that leadership is three things: influence, elevated thinking, as well as service excellence. I believe that these three qualities, things that I want to embody, and I believe that every leader needs to embody them. But most importantly, I think that these qualities, when you exhibit them consistently and effectively, it makes all the difference. And to do that, of course, you have to have courage in a world where it's difficult to have some conversations. So it's about learning from others, it's about collaborating and spreading the message about difficult things and how we can get through them together, how we can overcome them, and how, as a leader, you can take charge and make things happen through others. So hence why we're having these courageous leadership conversations. And like I said, it's always about the guests coming on board, the experts and the specialists sharing their perspective and takeaways that you can use to make a difference. And today I'm really excited to bring on board my guest, Professor Pooja Saini. I want to welcome her to join me now on Courageous Leadership Conversations. Welcome, Professor Saini.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today, Patience. I'm really excited.
So, and our topic today that we're really going to be diving into is called Courageous Leadership in Suicide Prevention, Saving Lives and Inspiring Change. And, there's no better person to really dive into this topic than Professor Singh. And let me just share with you why I think that. So, she's an award winning professor of suicide and self harm prevention. Her research interests are in suicide and self harm prevention, particularly in young people, cancer prevention in Black and Asian ethnic minority groups, reduction of health inequalities, and co production. A key activity for her is public engagement and involvement, and she aims to incorporate this in all aspects of her teaching and research. And notable clients or people she has worked with and collaborators are the NHS, James's Place, Samaritans, and various health charities. She is also a member of the International Association for Suicide Prevention, the co-chair of the Suicide Prevention in Primary Care Special Interest Group, and co-chair of the Women's Academic Network, LGAMU. She'll tell us the full meaning of that when she talks about herself a bit more. Women's Academic Network, and lead of the Research Center for Brain and Behavior. So I'm really interested in finding out more about what co-production is and the full meaning of LGMU. But however, I'm also excited to really welcome Professor Pooja today. So thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And LGMU is just the acronym for Liverpool John Moores University.
Okay. And what does co-production mean?
So, co production in the work I'm doing, it's about involving everybody that a service might be kind of developed for, the people delivering a service, the people who design it, and also carers of people who might be using a service. So, it's including everybody that a service is relevant for, from kind of the top to the end user, I'd say. So, co production for us is also involving people once a service has been developed to see whether it's working well, and to keep testing what's working well, what isn't, and to keep improving. But I think without co-production, you can't do that.
That's very rich, and that's I love that. I love all that, almost like 360 degree. action,
Yeah.
taking action. So just to share a little bit about how we met, when we met actually off online without seeing each other, when Professor Saini attended one of my speaking session at the Women in Public Sector Leadership Conference. And she made the point of mentioning her attendance and, the conference on LinkedIn. And I'm glad she did, because I didn't see faces during the session, so I just presented, and I went ahead and I thought, yeah, my name is mentioned by this person. I'm going to look her up, and I looked her up, and it became, oh, I'm the one who really needs to speak to this lady. I want to hear more from her, and also I realized that it's holiday season, it's Christmas, and there's a lot of issues that are happening around that maybe many of us are so in the buzz of the festive season, we don't notice that other people are going through a season of maybe loneliness and intense feelings of uh, emotions that cause them to feel down and out and hopeless. And when I looked at some of the statistics around this, which I got from the gov.uk website, and again, I don't know the full validity of this, but I know that this is something that Professor Saini works with every day. But I'll just read some of them for you. And it says that between June 2023 and August 2024, the suspected suicide rates in males were higher at 15.2 per 100,000 than in female at 5.3 per 100,000. So again, we're looking at a risk group that is commonly men also don't talk about things a lot. So it's just one of those things that always bugs me, having a son and a husband that I know they don't talk. Yeah. Then the age group with the highest rate of suspected suicide throughout the reporting period is those aged 45 to 64, and then followed by 25 to 44. This is interesting from the point of view of the whole midlife crisis period as well. So these figures really struck me. And then within the reporting periods, the rates were higher in June, July, and January. And January in particular, being that it's winter months, being that it's the darker months, and the months where people are just trying to have hope for a new year, it makes that significance. And there is the whole conversations around seasonal affective disorder. So these are just some of the statistics that I know that are out there that make the work that Professor Saini is doing very, very important. But to go to the questions that we would want you to help us answer, tell us a bit more about what inspired and influenced you to follow this career path, because it's a specialist area. I have never met anybody specializing in it, and that's why I jumped quickly to connect with you.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is something unusual about me being in this field is many people I've met work in this field because they've been bereaved by suicide. So that wasn't the initial reason that I stepped foot into this field. But I initially wanted to be a clinical psychologist, that my background was in psychology. But to gain a place on the course, I had to go and do practical work as a healthcare worker or support worker. And I ended up working in some South Asian communities in Rochdale with women to do with domestic violence with a housing association. And one thing I came across was the kind of high levels of suicidality and that hopelessness that many of the women had. Many who did have or didn't have mental health problems seemed to have a lot of hopelessness, especially if there was some breakdown in relationships, either with their partners or their children. And I think that was the first time I really saw the kind of effects of poverty, some really complex issues within communities. And I think because I'm from a South Asian background myself, it really struck me. I've been very fortunate. I've grown up in quite an affluent lifestyle. So I've seen a very different side of living throughout my childhood. And I suddenly was seeing a really different side through my early working career. But the high level of suicidality was quite sad to see. And then the second thing I did as part of my work, I worked in some youth offending centres, and a lot of them with young girls who were teenagers. And the amount of self-harm was rife. And even if they weren't self-harming when they came in, they were by the time they left. So I think there was two areas I was really kind of, I don't know, just opened my eyes to these two elements in life, and maybe that was a little bit of a drive to start working in the field. I also worked with the Home Office with asylum seekers for a year as well, and again there I met many people from, you know, with unbelievable careers, from really positive careers that they'd come from, but unfortunately, you know, due to having to claim asylum in the country, they'd had to leave that behind and were really struggling to make home here. And again, you saw a lot of hopelessness and kind of social isolation, and a lot of talk about suicide as well. So a job opportunity came up to do research in this area, and I applied for it, and I told them about these kind of communities and groups I'd spoken with. And I think that's what got me that job initially, is that I'd spoken with vulnerable populations. I had experience of speaking to people who may speak about difficult topics. But I think after getting that job, I really felt like I wanted to try and make change in some of those communities, with some of those young people, with people maybe coming from abroad. And I think that's what the driver was. I was then really lucky that I got offered to do a PhD in the topic of suicide prevention in primary care. And I took that up, and I've never left research. So I suppose I've kind of fell into it, even though I was on the clinical path. But yeah, no, I really loved research. And what I really loved about it is I felt like there was the real possibility that I might be able to help make change. I knew it'd be in the future, but I've already made some significant changes throughout my career, which I'm happy to share as well throughout the conversation.
Yes, and I think it would be brilliant later to kind of share some of those changes. There's some keywords that you mentioned there. And I think because we're speaking and we're talking into leadership, and the topic is about having those courageous leadership in suicide prevention, so it's all about what can people do to support others. And you talked about hopelessness. And a lot of times it doesn't just always show. Some people can be very enthusiastic, very bubbly, but deep down underneath, they are going through a period of feeling hopeless. And sometimes the triggers can come from things like breakdown in relationships. And you talked about the different side of things, where because some people that are very affluent, very look rich and everything, they could suffer with those kind the hopelessness as well, and you wonder why. But then there's the other side of the poverty in communities, like you, and we'll come to that a little bit. And you talk about it's interesting when you talk about self-harm, and you said that when people come in, they might not be self-harming. When they leave, they are. And it's that peer and association with others and how others are coping with the situation. You find yourself doing the same, and if it's common. And the other bit that you talked about that is interesting is the displacement that creates uh, crisis in people's lives, where you don't know where you belong, how you fit anymore, or you're trying to find it. And in our society, that there can be a lot of segregation, a lot of lack of inclusivity sometimes, and those things can really create problems for people. And these are things that people face every day. But you having this conversation is useful, but also saying things like the possibility for change. Over the holiday period, I stumbled on a documentary about Avicii, who is one of those, one of the greatest. They call him the greatest DJs for electric dance music and whatever, and a very young guy who committed suicide at 28.
Mm.
And I was intrigued by that. So I thought the documentary would be troubling for me, but I've got to watch it to see the personality of this person. And when I watched it all through, I was really troubled by it. And I was speaking to someone about it, and they were like, sounds to me, he also had autism, for example. I had those challenges with social interactions. Some of the things he was saying were already red flags that people were not taking note of. But in the final thing, he couldn't find himself feeling that anybody could help him. And even money couldn't help him. With 50 million in the bank, still, it
Mm.
didn't make a difference to when it came to that hopelessness. So, in terms of when we talk about courageous leadership in the context of the work you're doing on suicide and self harm prevention, because there were people around him, sane, reasonable people who thought that they were telling him to take it easy. His parents were concerned. There were so many concerned people. but it didn't work. So, in terms of courageous leadership, when it comes to suicide prevention or self harm, what are some of the key points that one needs to be aware of?
Yeah, I think for me, I think one thing I've learned even more over the years is the fact that just having a conversation, active listening, and being knowledgeable about suicide awareness as well, and not being frightened to have a
Mm,
conversation. The biggest things I learned when I went on suicide awareness trainings was to be very direct when asking people, are you feeling suicidal, or are you thinking of, harming yourself? And I think that's one thing people have always been very frightened to do, because they feel like they might be putting an idea in
mm,
somebody's head. But actually, if somebody is thinking that, I think it's quite good for them to think, oh, this person's actually asking me, directly. I don't need to be scared to tell them that this is on
mm,
my mind. And it can start the conversation much more easily than if you're kind of tiptoeing around, trying not to ask the direct question. So one thing I would say is not being frightened of asking the direct question, but also, if you are going to ask a direct question, having the knowledge of some of the support that's available to people, some of the kind of charities that are available, obviously going to your GP and speaking to them and trying to access mental health care. But I think, having a lot of avenues to go down. We know at the moment access to some healthcare can be really delayed,
mm,
um, and that's not really good if someone's in a crisis.
mm,
If someone's having a heart attack, as we say, you can't just leave them for 6 months, and not deal with it. Whereas if someone's in a mental health crisis, unfortunately, you might be placed on a mental health waiting list for
mm.
6 months, and your crisis will get worse. So I think you have to be kind of, make sure you know about the resources, the ones that are available at the end of the phone, down the road, or that might take a little bit longer to access. Luckily, I've been involved with a lot of charities across the country. And like I said before, many people who've started these charities or this work have been bereaved by suicide themselves. And
Mm,
they maybe didn't have access to something, or their loved ones didn't have access. And that's why they've developed and created these services. And in some parts of the country, we really have got a lot of good services now. In other parts, they're still lacking for whatever reasons, might be down to funding, commissioning,
mm,
or it may be due to things not happening in those areas as much. It could be a positive reason why there's not as many services in those
mm.
areas. But I think being knowledgeable about what's available and not being frightened to ask
Yeah.
somebody and have a conversation.
I think that directness bit is very important. That sometimes we don't want to be direct because we don't want to hurt someone's feelings. And I think what comes to mind when we're talking about it is like the person might feel like I'm being confrontational to this person. Um, and you might get it wrong. And if you get it wrong, it's like, oh, why do you think your life is better than mine? That you have to
Yeah,
ask me that kind of question.
yeah.
But also, people get defensive when you ask them those questions. So I get it. But I also think that coming from the place of tough love, I was affected by suicide at a very young age. And I remember that I was having conversations with this person. I saw that their life was very difficult. And I started to have conversations. I'm a person of faith. And so, from a very young age, I've always been into faith. And I felt that that's what kept me off the cliff edge all the time because I was very melancholic as well. So, when I saw their life and the way they were, I started to write to them and I started to talk to them, but they were very defensive. And now looking back, I think that was brave because they were older, and there were people that would say, "Shut up," in African
Mm.
culture and everything. But I didn't again then follow it up, and I regret that because I was onto something. They eventually succeeded after maybe like 2, 3 attempts. And those attempts, unfortunately, nobody was telling us about them because that's another thing that I want to come to, which is the conversations that need to be had in certain cultures, certain societies. In Africa, secrecy is part of what you're trained. Your parents say You must not let the people know. You must not talk about these things. You learn that secrecy is important for dignity of the family, and like, don't bring embarrassment to a family, don't talk about it. And so people tend to suffer in silence and hide what they're going through. So sometimes this whole thing can come from that directness as well, and people wanting to keep their private lives private can be an issue that can arise. So, in your research, which spans critical areas like suicide in young people and cancer prevention in the Black and Asian communities, I've already talked about that silence and that secrecy. But what systemic barriers have you come across that really have hindered people from getting the help they need and being able to talk to people? And how can leaders, you've already said, having that knowledge, follow up conversations are very important, follow up care, follow up checking in, and pastoral care, and then follow up on maybe knowledgeable. And this is part of what we're doing, that you share some of this knowledge and people will have access. But what are some of that critical research you've done to the barriers that you can share to help leaders and organizations dismantle any barriers for people?
Yeah. So, firstly, I've just been involved in a book that's been published, Suicide in Cultures. And
Mm,
I led the chapter that was on South Asian populations,
yeah.
because that's the work I've done most in, but it covers, all different populations. But I think the stigma that you talk about and the secrecy is a real barrier, huge barrier. And some of the similar things you've spoken about are evident in South Asian cultures as well, of the secrecy, even not just to do with mental health, but even to do with cancer and
Mm,
other diseases as well. So it's kind of like, no one will marry into the family, or no one will want to be associated with us if they know
mm,
there's mental health or there's this. And it's really interesting because I was born and brought up in the UK, as were
mm,
my siblings and my cousins. We're now a generation where we don't hide, and we're quite open. So if someone's had cancer in the family, they've told people about it, and they've really had that support from their community and their friends, and that's helped them through the journey. But our
mm,
parents' generation found that really difficult. And they would always say, why have you told people? Why are you sharing this? This is kind of a private thing. And if our parents' generation get ill, even now, many of them will say, don't tell anybody
mm,
that this is happening. And we have to just, kind of respect their generational views. And we
mm,
might not disclose that why are parents in hospital. But for
mm,
our generation, our parents are starting to realize that we do want to share and we want to reduce the stigma. And actually, it helps us in the healing process. So I think I've seen a real shift with generations of
mm,
this, but I've definitely been brought up the same, like you're saying, with that kind of secrecy element. Um, I think when it comes to my research, what we've done is one area where I know I've been quite successful and really proud of actually is welcoming and encouraging, especially women, I'd say from ethnic minority groups and communities, to be part of research. And I
mm.
actually got to know them because I used to be a Bollywood dance instructor, of all things, so very different to my research.
Yeah.
And I met many of them because they wanted to come to my fitness classes. And within those classes, you end up having conversations about health indirectly. And I asked some of them, would you like to be involved in research? And now many of them are involved in research. And one of them actually emailed me today to say that they're going for a job as a public advisor with the NHS now.
Wow.
So it's really helped them and empowered them
Mm,
actually to feel needed within a workplace. So they've contributed because of their experience of a health issue, but they've actually ended up now gaining jobs. One person's become a magistrate, one person's applying for a job, like I said. Um, Another person, they said it gets them a lot more respect in the home,
mm,
because they were always seen as a housewife, and mum doesn't know anything and my wife doesn't know anything,
mm,
and now her kids are asking her for support on their schoolwork and presentations. Another person said it just gets them out of the house regularly, and they've now got a friendship group. So I think there's a lot more that comes to being involved in research
mm,
than just getting the voices of people
mm,
from those communities. I think from the other side, where I've had clinicians sat in a meeting and they've kind of been a bit nervous about people coming in the meeting room who are coming with, you know, the background of a health issue. And I think sometimes they're even more nervous when they're from other communities
Yeah.
and from other racial backgrounds. I definitely think it causes another different shift. By the end of the meetings, they can see the value in having everybody involved in the conversation and the
Mm.
value of how that might increase people's uptake. So the cancer work I was involved in, one of the women said they never knew until they attended this meeting the fact that the mammogram clinics only had women doctors and
Mm.
nurses. They assumed that it would be men or women, and they weren't allowed to go to the appointments because at home nobody knew that as well. So
Yeah.
just sharing the knowledge, even from the NHS in this case, that, you
Mm.
know, they're women only clinics, reduce some barriers for some family members to allow their daughter-in-laws or their wives to go and attend a screening appointment. So I think there's, you know, the conversation can really help. And then those women obviously learn new knowledge and take it back to their communities.
Yeah.
They also fed it into the meeting that they didn't know. So then more awareness has been raised, more leaflets in other languages, more videos. So I think these simple conversations can have a massive, massive impact.
Wow. And as you were talking, I was thinking about last year, the awareness of the different barriers and conversations that people can't have and things like that got me very interested in looking at coaching from the lens of identity and intersectionality, the different hidden parts of what makes a person who they are that don't always factor in, that causes them to struggle with barriers that you would not be aware of, you don't know about. And I like what you talking about, that suicide in cultures. I hope that we can find a link to that and put it in the
Yeah,
comments for
I can
people.
send that over.
I think that's important as well. And of course, you do have like your page, which has a lot of resources there that people can tap into. So there's really kind of like, if you're a leader, one of the things you said that really struck me was the fact that when people came around you as a leader, you created other leaders. And that's one thing that I have always talked to people about with regards to leadership. It's not about being in the forefront doing it all by yourself. It's about how can you create other leaders around you so that the heavy lifting, when you say, who, and people say, oh, yeah, you get 5 or 6 hands doing it. So by empowering these women, they go into their communities, they go into their homes. Those children are growing up differently in that home.
Mm-hmm.
The partner is having a different perspective if they are those kind of people that are open to new perspectives. And it's like they say, you don't know what you don't know. And so when you know simple things, basic things like what you just talked about, that's very important. Even I, who doesn't have a lot of that barrier in my culture, when I'm going somewhere that involves male or female, my husband would say, is it a male person? Like if I'm doing the massage, you say male or female, or. And I have to really think about that. Not in the past, I'll be like, I don't think it matters much, but sometimes, and that can be a barrier and it can hold people back from going, if I don't want to do that, and for a longer time than they need to keep holding back. And when they now do get the help, it's too late. So also, that brings me to the next question, which is for people who are struggling with suicidal thoughts. And before, sometimes it's those practical things you can do by yourself on your
Mm-hmm.
own first, as that stepping point before you start asking for help, because that's actually harder. But what if you can do something? So what are some of the practical advice and steps that you would ask people to do,
Yeah.
helped to support them on their path towards getting away from those thoughts?
Yeah, so if people wanted to start looking at things on their own, I think one thing is now there's some really good kind of digital support. You know, there's a Stay Alive app that's been created by Grassroots and Samaritans. So some of the big, you know, charities have created some really amazing resources online. Locally where I am in Cheshire and Merseyside, there's a lot of resources online with our public health kind of websites. So looking online, I mean, can have pros and cons, I suppose. Is, you know, your cons, you might go down a rabbit hole and see some
Yeah.
really worrying information. But on a positive, you can get some really good tips and links. And one element that would happen if you were to get support anyway is safety planning. And with this Stay Alive app, you can do your own safety plan on there, or you could do it with, you know, someone at home if you want to do. And it's about thinking through what triggers, you know, some of those thoughts and feelings, and what kind of is happening before you get to that point, and how to cope with those times, and also thinking about how you have coped. You know, so for some people, they've already had these thoughts many times, but they'll have done things that for whatever reason has helped them and been a positive in them not pursuing any thoughts. So also thinking about what were their coping mechanisms, and they might not have realized they were coping mechanisms. And it might be doing an activity, it might be cooking, it might be listening to music, it might be speaking to someone in particular. So it's thinking about those things, and then it's having those things written down so that when you do find yourself going to that place, you can actually access your safety plan, whether it's on a piece of paper or on your phone. And you can remind yourself, okay, I might do this kind of either distracting activity or a helpful activity that can help them. So in the first instance, that could be something that people could do on their own. But I would always say that, you know, they should be trying to get help, whether they go to their GP or to any other significant other. You know, you talked about faith. It might be that you want to go to church, you want to go to a temple. That could be where you get your kind of support. It could be within a family, it could be within your friends, or even at work. You know, we have occupational health at work, and you know, in a good way. I don't think many people use it, but sometimes I think it is there to be used. And even for mental health, you know, they're available, and we should access some of all the support that's available to us, really.
Yeah.
So I think once you make the step and you can, in a way, admit to yourself that, okay, this is something I need to kind of deal with and I need to get help with, I think that's half the battle done. I think getting to that place for some people can be really, really difficult. But if, like you said before about the person you spoke with and wrote letters to, if they have a lot of complexity in their lives, you know, it kind of becomes, you know, you can kind of see why someone might get to that point.
Yeah.
But to be able to say to them, and this is with some of the work I've been doing, if you can say to somebody, you know, what you've just told me sounds really difficult. Even that realization for some people, I think, can be quite enlightening.
Yeah.
That, oh, okay, this is really hard, what I'm having to deal with. And it is okay that I feel like this. So I think having that conversation sometimes can just make you realize that it's not unreasonable why you've got to this place, but what can we do to give you hope and make you feel better? I think one thing you picked up on before, you said about there being the, you know, the significant difference with men and women. And within my PhD, one thing I found is that men were going to see their GPs, they were going to primary care, they were saying quite openly they were suicidal. And so what that made me feel at the end of my PhD is, you know, A&E isn't necessarily the place for these men to go, but the GPs did not really have many places to send them. As well at that time, this is 15 years ago now that I did my piece of research. And so I helped to, I kept talking about it with people at the school gate, at work, anywhere, the fact that we need something in the community for men, something that's kind of non-medical, much more homely. And then I was introduced to the founders of James's Place. And sadly, their son died when he was 21 by suicide, and they were from a very affluent background. So, you know, like we said before, that class doesn't necessarily come into it at all, or finances. And they had a business plan that pretty much was mirroring what I was saying from the evidence base. And we joined together, and the first James's Place was opened for men in Liverpool in 2018. And there's now 3 open, Newcastle, London, and there's 2 more opening in Birmingham and another city this year and next year. And within that work, you know, we've really seen the kind of positive progress of having a centre that's situated in a community that's quite homely, that is for men only, and it was designed in a way that men wanted. We did focus groups with men who had been suicidal or who work with suicidal men to really influence the feel of the place. They wanted a lovely outdoor space, so that's always been very important as well. And then even the sessions that they have are co-produced between the therapist and the men. And a lot of this is around the safety planning that I just mentioned there, and them having something to take away with them that they can then look back on. So it's a brief intervention. And on average, men go around 6 times
Yeah.
over kind of a 3 to 4, 5 week period. But it helps them get back on track. And then they do have this safety plan to go back to, and they can always go back if they need to the center. So I think an element I feel is if people get support as soon as they're in a crisis, it can be brief psychological support, and that can be enough to help them to think through why they keep getting to this place and what helps them to with their recovery, and what can help give them hope as well, and to signpost them to other places of support as well that might be relevant. And it might be to do with housing or debt
Yeah.
or alcoholism. They might just need to be signposted to where they need support for the underlying issue that's not actually the suicidality.
Yeah. There's a lot of nuggets there, and I'm hoping that people who, at least for starters, run occupational health strategies for organizations can see some nuggets that they can put in. Because when you mentioned that, I remember that when my mom died, I struggled to cope, and I struggled for many years. But in the initial stage, I was coming to work and struggling. Fortunately, the organization I worked for had occupational health and had counseling that I could tap into, therapy and counseling that I could tap into. In those earlier weeks and months of losing my mom, and I was trying to use work to come back to work. But I remember that I had suicidal thoughts then, not necessarily I would go to sleep and say, oh, I wish I could just be with my mom. I really don't want to open my eyes.
Yeah.
And I'll be disappointed in the morning when I'm awake, like I'm not with my mom, I'm awake. But I would dress up and I would go to work. And I started presenting with lots of migraines. And I had a crisis once on the road where I just was driving to an appointment, and that was it. I was really in a bad place. And that was when my boss said, no, you're gonna call these people and you're gonna have a conversation. And it made all the difference. They gave me time. I was going during work times, and it really helped. So sometimes it's like also the attitude of people, the dismissiveness. There's a lot of dismissiveness. Oh, is it that? Oh, you're not yet over it already,
Yeah.
struggling. And that statement that you said, where people just acknowledge how hard something is, can
Yeah.
it's like an emotional shot into the heart that says, yeah, I'm not odd that I'm having to feel that this is a heavy thing to carry. And I'm not odd that I'm having to feel weak about this. Because when you look at social media, you see all the strong people, or you look around you, and most especially what you've mentioned about men, that's important because that macho, I can do it all, I'm coping situation.
Yeah.
And what you said is very important for anybody in a position of policy to take note of, which is they do go to the GP, but they have no place to be signposted to. And
Yeah.
when they're not signposted, they go back and think, well, it's just a conversation, it's not helping me. And men knowing, I have someone who said to me that women might be telling you because they are trying to get attention, but men are telling you because they intend to do it. You know, that's the
Yeah, and I
difference.
think, yeah, and I was just going to say, talking about women, so that's an area I'm working in a lot now to do
Yeah.
with. I was asked to get involved in some research to do with suicide prevention and menopause, and the reason why is because a menopause specialist had said to me that so many women are coming into the clinic for
Mm,
menopause, but they're talking about feeling suicidal
yeah.
and literally being in a suicidal crisis. And she just said this is like becoming more and more common. And women are phoning the administrator saying, I'm suicidal. I need to get an appointment for
Mm,
my menopause. And it was kind of I think, a strange concept that they were phoning for kind of obviously support with their hormones, but they were
mm,
talking about suicide a lot. So it's an area we've been looking into. But there's definitely, even I never thought about it. I think because I've been so focused on men for many years,
mm,
is the highest risk group for women is age 45 to 55. And it
mm.
is the menopausal age as
Yes,
well. And,
yes.
how has that not kind of, I don't know, been a light bulb in anyone's
Mm,
mind? Because it's been that age for years. So
yes.
even though the rates are less in women, they're
Mm,
highest in that age group. And self-harm and suicidality is increasing massively in teenage girls and young
mm,
women,
yeah,
again, where there's a lot more kind of hormonal shifts and
yeah, yeah,
changes. And another element you mentioned earlier was autism,
yeah,
to do with the program you watched.
yes,
And autism, again, is another aspect in ADHD that's coming up massively.
yeah, yeah,
And even more so in women because it's diagnosed much later because there's a
yeah,
lot more masking. So there's a lot of other areas where
mm,
there's a lot more work to be done for
yeah,
starters, but also women are a really important group to focus on because the rates are increasing. I think
mm,
maybe in one sense, because the rates are so high in men, a lot of focus has been there.
mm.
But I think in the last couple of years, I think there's been this notion of the rates are increasing way too quickly in some
For women,
groups of
yeah,
females now, and we need
yeah,
to quickly have a
do
look why
something.
and address this issue.
Yeah,
So there's a lot more research being done in those areas, and some of our indirect outcomes of looking at A&E data for people attending in crisis is the fact of how many girls or women are attending who are waiting for a diagnosis for
mm,
autism or ADHD, who are coming in suicidal crisis or for self-harm. So there's definitely some patterns and trends showing, but it's just not been a focus
yeah,
previously, but it's starting to be now. So that's an area where a lot more research will be coming out from my group as well. And maybe because I'm at that age myself as
mm,
well, perimenopause and things,
mm,
it's important for me as well now, because I've
mm,
got friends around me going through
mm.
those stages, and where you can see maybe some people having some negative mental health consequences with that. So that's another area I think is really important,
Yeah,
and I'm doing a lot of research in.
yeah, and there's a saying, unless you know where the shoe is pinching, you probably would. So for me, increasingly my work, I'm increasingly understanding the impact of neurodiversity. I'm understanding the menopause element because, and when I'm working with middle-aged women or women going through that period of life where they are not even aware sometimes because they think, oh, I'm still just in my mid 40s. Well, you might have started having perimenopause
Yeah,
and you don't. And the key element of it is almost like this different person keeps waking up every day. I recognize that in my own journey. It's like a different person is waking up every day. You can't recognize this person, and mentally it messes with your head because you might be a bubbly person and suddenly for no reason you're just moody. You just find
yeah,
things overwhelming. You find things too much, or you have brain fog and start to think, am I having brain tumor or something? There's all sorts of things that this menopause thing poses, and I'm glad in the world how it's being addressed because, and I'm glad as well that it is one way that women are getting support that they need
yeah.
generally because women don't have enough research around the things that happen.
Mm.
And yeah, carry on. You wanted to say something
Yeah,
important.
no,
We don't want to miss any
just
bit.
I just wanted to highlight some positives as well in some policy changes. So
Yeah.
one thing I think that's really good in some of the new menopause guidance is the fact they're recognizing that
Mm,
Asian women and Black and kind of other minority groups uh, actually go through menopause a lot earlier.
mm,
So they're recognizing that now is that perhaps we do enter the perimenopause stage much younger, and so when we're coming to the GP with issues, they need to be addressed younger, and it shouldn't be just an age factor or things like that. So
mm,
that's one thing that's really good. They're also recognizing mental health a lot more,
yeah.
and not putting everything down to depression, but actually
Yeah.
some things might be due to hormonal changes. And
Mm,
I read just today there was some new policies out for cancer for earlier diagnosis as well. And that there's been a real improvement in the
mm,
rates of early diagnosis. So I think there's some real positive work that's been going on with policy changes and what our research is kind of influencing,
Mm,
if you like, from across the country, across the world as well. And I think one thing that people have said to me about the suicide prevention work I'm involved in, I do suicide prevention in schools as well, is they felt like at the end of, the presentations, is that the work is leading to hope.
yeah,
A lot of these brief psychological interventions or the safety planning or the very hands-on work with people in crisis, it's ending with a lot of positivity and
yes.
not with higher rates of suicide. So we
Mm,
hope that that continues, and that, it doesn't end up being a topic that we all shy from and we're all scared to talk about. And
mm.
actually, we talk about it with more hope, and that everyone can be more involved in that as well.
Yeah. I guess as you were talking, I started thinking about the fact that if you're a leader in an organization, the board, or you don't have an occupational health department, it's a department doesn't have to be a big number of people, but just an area where people can have policies that relate to this kind of things, and
Yeah,
holistic policies that look at every aspect of the things that can trigger the lack of ability to cope at work, to bring your best to work, to bring your performance to work. I think that's part of the reason why we're having these conversations. There, most people spend a lot of their lives in the workplace, majority of the hours of their lives in the workplace, and that is where they then mask the situation and have
yeah,
the few hours they have on their own to try and pick up the broken pieces and don't cope very well. So if they can be getting that support around the areas where they spend most of their lives, and you can think of life work balance instead of just work life balance, it helps. I like the idea of safety planning, which is if you put a plan in place and you help people and support people through it, or people feel empowered because they have something that
yeah.
they can put a safety plan in place. All this information I think has been so beneficial and so useful. I'm so happy that you came today. I'm so happy that so if there are any final thoughts, that you've shared a lot of resources, and like you said, you have a page that people can go to and get a lot of things that have been written, but there are some of them you give us links to put it in the comments. But are there any final thoughts on what you might want to share with people, what they can do, or any final kind of wisdom that you have in the work that you've done that you can share with the audience?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing is being kind, listening to people and empowering them. I think that feeling of empowerment is really powerful for
Mm,
individuals. And even empowering people to start to help themselves feel better. It might sound really simple, but it's not. But I think when you can see that happening, it's kind of magical, really, because you can see how it makes someone feel really positive. Even in the workplace, I obviously work with a lot of students, and you see them going through a lot of struggles, whether it's with their assignments or personal life, things, and empowering them to kind of, deal with the issue at hand, but give themselves time as well to take on board what's happened, but empowering them to kind of, get up again,
yeah,
and try and resolve whatever it is that's kind of got them upset or made them feel negative. I think that for me is the most important thing in leadership,
yes.
is, being kind and listening to people. I don't think you need to be, I think that generation's gone where you have to be a really cruel leader, to get people to
Mm,
do work. I think actually being a nice person and treating people like humans, at work, and if they've had a loss or if they've had a relationship
mm,
breakdown or illness, taking that on board, like you said, and giving people time, I think is really powerful, and it actually
mm.
helps people be more productive in the long term as well. So that they'd be my key messages, I think, as from a leadership point of view.
Yes. And I think it's a brilliant one that you've said. And also, what I want to add to it is kindness starts from self. And I think a lot of people that are cruel to others are already cruel to themselves behind the scenes. You
Yeah,
cannot give an apple tree does not produce a lemon. It definitely produces apples. There is no
yeah,
way, except of course if somebody went and injected and cross pollinated or did something to create a hybrid fruit. If you are going to be kind, you have to be kind to yourself first. And offer yourself, if you've offered yourself grace in failure, grace in mistakes, then you will know how to offer grace and understanding to other people who are being challenged in different ways. If you've had to manage the challenges of being neurodiverse, you'll be able to understand and help other people. But if you've not had that, kindness is just a general quality that when a leader shows that, it helps other people to kind of trust you, follow you. It makes your leadership process easier rather than harder. And I think empowerment is a word that is overused. Even Chat GPT loves to use it a lot, and some people are just running away from it. But I guess it's important to recognize that what it just means is that give somebody the opportunity and ability to help themselves, facilitate that ability to help themselves, so that even when you're not there, you've left them with something. Is that adage that says, give a person a fish or teach them how to fish, So
Mhm.
if you
Yep,
can go that
absolutely.
extra mile as a leader to do that, that's useful. So just want to say thank you so much for all that you have shared. It's been a brilliant session. I'm going to watch it
Thank
again.
you.
I'm going to listen to it again. And the resources that we'll put out there, we hope it to be useful for many people, whether it's schools, whether it's organizations, and things that you don't know. Now you know them. And these basic things I didn't know, and I was concerned to know. And this is useful for parents as well, because behind the scenes,
Yeah.
parents deal with children that are struggling in their academics, struggling with bullying, struggling with all sorts of things. It's so valuable, so useful. And I want to thank you for the work you do.
Oh,
Thank God
thank
for
you.
people like you and
I'll
what
give
you
I'll
do.
give you links for, like you say, the different
Yeah,
groups, Papyrus for
yeah,
parents and other ones as well. So
yeah.
I'll share all that with you.
And I just want to add from my own perspective as well. From childhood, what has helped me is leaning into my faith, looking for that higher power when things look like the serendipity prayer that says, teach me to know what I can change and also make effort to change it. And then help me to know the things that I can't change and the courage to know the difference, that I can't change and accept. And it brings me to just share this one quote as well, which says, it's not a quote, it's something I saw on Reddit and I thought it was important to, it was a good perspective. And this person said, I saw a friend post about their struggle with suicide. And a quote in their story was, I came to realize that I didn't want to die. I just wanted my life as I knew it to end. That's very important. I think that sentence is so important. Your life can always take a different path and direction. And I think that is kind of a light bulb moment for me. Like, okay, I don't want to die, but I want my life as it is to end. I don't want this situation. I don't want this crisis. I don't want this struggle, but I don't know how to get away from it. And when you recognize that, it changes the way you approach it. How can you help people to be empowered, like Professor Sani has said, to have a different pathway? So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Professor Sani. Thank you for coming along. And we're still fine tuning the timings and everything of how these courageous leadership conversations will be taking place. Feel free to send your suggestions to us, ideas, and topics that you might want us to talk about. We're here and we're interested in having those conversations. And feel free to share the links of all these conversations with people that of influence, leaders, and yourself. Watch it and make a difference. Take care and God bless. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.